Welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 161 with my guest and friend, Cenk Ergun. Cenk, this is the second time on the podcast. We basically chat, catch up. I haven't seen Cenk in probably a couple years, maybe, sadly. But he moved to Berlin recently, and that's where he was for this podcast. He's a composer that's worked with So Percussion a few times, a piece called Proximity, which we talk about a bit in this podcast, and then also another piece called Snares, and another piece called Use. I talk with Cenk a little bit today about creation, how you generate content, and just how you deal with life during a pandemic. And it's always good to get caught back up with Cenk. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. This is Cenk Ergun. Take care. Bye. Well, let's gavel this to order here, Cenk. I won't make you talk about your kids' drumming skills here, and
I'm happy to.
We are communicating. I am in Manchester, Connecticut, and you are in Berlin, Germany right now. So if there's any delay or we get cut off, we'll just reconnect and I'll edit it, and it'll feel like it never happened.
Sounds good. Why are you in Connecticut?
My wife has a job here in Manchester, just east of Hartford, about 20 minutes.
Oh, I forgot that you guys moved from Scarsdale.
Yeah, we now live.
And when did this happen?
About a year ago. We're coming up on, I think, the end of June.
Sorry, you're trying to start the podcast, but I forgot about this.
It's the end of June is when we moved here a year ago, so we're coming up on a year.
Okay, is it good?
Yeah, I mean, I like living in New York, but it's a nice place. The house is lovely. Like we just rent this house, and it's like everything's cheaper, and it's all the things that are good about not living in New York, financially speaking.
Yeah.
But I'm locked indoors. Even if I lived in New York, it's not like I'd be out running around.
It doesn't matter where anybody is.
Yeah.
Anymore.
So I mean, I've spoken to more people on Zoom during the pandemic than I did. I think I've done like 100 podcasts since the pandemic happened, and it took me 3 years to do 100 podcasts. The first 100, it's just wild to all of the things that have happened as a result of this are just interesting to clock. But one of the things, Cenk, like we're coming up on online SOCI. Our first, SOCI's coming up.
Yeah.
Normally we do it in person. And you've been somebody, we've played your music at SOCI. You've written pieces for our students to premiere at SOCI. You've worked with So Percussion and I'll say right here, Cenk, I'm not a fan of all of your music. I'll say it right to your face. And anybody who maybe hasn't heard our first podcast, I don't care if they understand.
I'm not a fan of all members of So Percussion.
That's fine.
But, I like most of them.
We have a quorum. That's all I care about. But you're somebody whose music So has played for a long time. You're a friend of ours. I would consider you a friend of mine, despite my feelings on your art. But I would say you're an important voice in my growth just as a musician, but in terms of So's growth as a musician and the content we've given at SOCI. And your name came up the other day as like, we want to, how are we going to? It's easy to talk about your music when you're in the room. Like your music has such nuance, and there's like all of these. There's a million different layers to it. It's like being in the room to hear all those subtleties is really crucial. But we feel like it's important. I want to talk to students about your music, even though like over Zoom, like I know how picky you are about your monitoring. So I'm assuming Zoom's audio settings are not ideal for you. But all of that said, I'm kind of curious just to pick your brain right now, Cenk, knowing what I know about you and the way you write music, the way you think about music. Where has your head been since this lockdown started? And how have you been thinking about, let's try to maybe wall this off as a safe, we don't have to talk about like police brutality or, racism or any of the issues that are currently the big ones in the world. But I'm curious just from an artist, how, and maybe those seep into your art making, and I'll let you speak to that, but how have you been thinking about, your whole life leading up to this point was as an artist and a composer, and now the world shut down. And I will say for myself, I've been wondering whether or not my life choices have been wise and what to do with them moving forward. So I'm curious for you, Cenk, how have you been thinking about this stuff?
Well, you said something, I remember, when the pandemic was really raging in New York. I mean, now it's raging in the rest of the U.S., but you said something about a sandcastle by the beach as your... That you'd built this and maybe it wasn't such a good idea.
Well, I didn't realize that the sandcastle I built was right on the edge of the water. Like you
Right
didn't,
on the edge of the
yeah.
water. Yeah. That was very well put. I've always felt that way. I feel like I've known that the sandcastle I built was on the edge of the water, and I've never felt like I was quite able to build it, form it. I feel like always the waves come and eat away at it, but I keep
Yeah.
rebuilding it.
Hmm.
So that in the pandemic hasn't changed that. I became very sad and very worried, like everybody else, about, well, people dying,
Hmm.
uh, other people staying alive, but just having their lives turned upside down. And then, like everybody else, worrying about my family and friends and so on. But that aside, I found the pandemic and the lockdown and the psychology that that created a little exciting, to be honest,
How so?
because it's like, you know, snow day or something. Snow day, but extended to weeks and
It's a
weeks.
snow quarter. Like we've had a quarter of the year to just be snowed in.
Yeah, where, you know, well, all these things that regulate our lives uh, uh, are now erased. The rules are thrown out the window, and everybody's is like trying to figure it out. And for me, that was kind of exciting because I feel like I spend my daily life in that mode anyway. But then I felt like everybody else was in that mode, so I felt less lonely
Oh
in that
wow. Yeah.
sense, and I appreciated how, you know, it's sort of like, you know, in the States around Christmas time, everybody calls each other and checks up on each other at the end of the year. You know, even if you haven't talked to somebody for a whole year, you make an effort to like call and get together or something. And that's what was happening, right? Was that your experience? Like you were checking up on your people, like where are they? What are
Uh,
they doing
you mean at the end of the year or during the pandemic?
during the pandemic?
Yeah, like I said, I think I've done 100 podcasts, and it's not because I was like I'm going to do a lot of podcasts. It just felt like the only thing I could do. Like I talked with Gray about making something during. You know, he was very much a like not a hands off, but like you can't force anything right now. Like what are you trying to do? And I felt like I have no desire to make coronavirus music. I have no desire to write text about coronavirus and try to do it in some
Yeah,
performative way. I have no desire to make steel drum art about, you know, COVID-19 or Donald Trump or any of the things going on.
yeah.
The only thing I can do is press record on this thing and be like, hello. Like that's all I
Talk to
could get out
people.
of my mouth in March.
Well, I think that's
And it
valuable.
helped. But it helped. Like to me, that's like it really felt like you're right. This I haven't checked in, and the same. I would say the same thing happened with the like because we're locked in. Like I said, I'm in Connecticut. When the protests were all happening, like I was never more. I've been in contact with more people in my life since March than I have been in the
Yeah,
40 years leading up to it.
it's interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sort of like now it's a little bit of that is lost almost.
Mm.
The first sort of emergency feeling is gone with everybody, and I almost miss it. And actually, in the States, especially, it's a necessary feeling still,
Mm.
as we're seeing. We're right. We're wishing that people were still as freaked out about it as they were a few months ago,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not going well right now. Another thing that I found was, I think a lot of other people felt this was, it was impossible to focus on anything for longer than 30 seconds. I stopped being able to read books. I just now I can read again.
Dude, me too. Like
But
I just started reading a book yesterday, and it felt
yeah,
incredible,
yeah, it's
incredible. Like it was amazing.
on the first days, I was, you know, I'd been reading a book and I just like, I keep looking at it. I can't, my mind is wandering. I can't, you know, then I look at the news, I look at the book again, and then my son, you know, we're all home. And when you're home with an 8-year old who's jumping around in a Pilates ball, traveling the whole apartment, it's already hard to focus on anything. But it was just, you know, the emotions of that moment. But one thing, you know, like everybody else, I wanted to reach out to everybody, and and so I talked to a lot of people, but I also did make some music,
Hmm.
which is very for me. It's not very characteristic because I think some people said, I'm just going to process this for a while. I'm not going to respond to this. I don't need to make art out of this. I don't need to respond to it with my music. And this, I totally get that. And when tragedies of similar size have happened in the States or in Turkey or in other ways that I care about, I've never directly addressed them with my music because I like to keep my music abstract for one thing. I don't like to tell stories or give messages or things like that. I feel like,
Well, that's true because I've gotten absolutely nothing from your music.
yeah, I mean, I don't want to.
Just
I
to be
don't want
clear, I was
to.
joking. Everybody who's listening,
Oh, I was, I was going to take that as a
I've
compliment.
gotten zero messages from you at all in all of your music.
Well, I try to give zero messages
Yeah.
because I think, it's restrictive. Once you try to attach a message to your art, I think it restricts the possibilities of how it can be perceived.
How do you deal with restriction?
Or
I mean, how do you? This is something too. Like, I don't know how to ask the question. Like you, because I don't know all of your music super duper well. But what I do know, it's like proximity. You did have a pretty strict restriction, which was E flat. Like now, maybe there was other things that you restricted yourself, but that was sort of the big picture guidepost, right? Like, and
I'm
that
totally into restriction and limitation and narrowing down the material and sort of focusing in on one thing. Musically speaking,
do
yes.
you feel like that sort of like, I mean, that's a form of structure in and of itself. Like you're giving yourself something to hang something on, right? Like you're not allowing yourself to cook with every spice. You're only allowed salt and pepper.
Yeah, what
And
can I do with these three notes?
right. And but how do you feel like in moments like this, where did you find your instincts going when you started making music again? You mentioned that you made some stuff. Like
Yeah.
how did you start?
Okay, how did I start? So it's very interesting. So this is, let's try to keep this. This is going to be a, a, a long-winded kind of answer because, and everybody else felt this. Uh, the virus feeling of emergency was one thing until the George Floyd killing, and then right after that, the protests started happening. The virus started feeling completely irrelevant and not important all of a sudden. At least,
Whether it
at
was or
least,
not is another story, but it definitely felt that way. Like there was,
yeah.
it
I
was
mean,
wild to see. Yeah.
we forgot about the virus. I forgot about the virus. It didn't seem important, even though it wasn't taking a break and it was still there and all that. So with something like that, I found that much harder. I find that much harder to respond to in the moment in an artistic way. I don't feel like I have the capacity or the position to do so. I could not possibly give a relevant or helpful message with what I do musically. It feels stupid. In the same way with when 9/11 happened, it never crossed my mind to respond to that with my music directly. Of course, you respond to it because you're alive in that moment and you're living through it, and the music that you make afterwards is going to come out differently than if you had not experienced this tragedy. But if you look at the examples of pieces of music made about 9/11, they're all terrible. None of them can come close to depicting or responding in a meaningful way to the tragedy that happened. So I would never try. Having said that, during the pandemic, this feeling of the need to reach out and check up on your people and the need to connect, all of a sudden we can see each other. All of a sudden we can go to concerts, and I'm imagining all my friends, including you guys, stopping their livelihood of giving concerts, and that just felt terrible. And Italy is a culture and country very close to my heart because my grandmother was Italian. Um, and during the first days of the pandemic, Italy was one of the hardest hit countries, hundreds of people dying every day. And we're watching that all day. And like everybody else, I saw some very touching videos of Italians singing to each other from balconies, and that really, that brought me to tears, uh, and that gave me the idea to communicate with, they were communicating with each other through, from balcony to balcony. I'm like, how can I do that? How can I communicate with my people through sound?
Mm-hmm.
So I got the idea to, and at the same time, I was still trying to make music for myself just to keep some sanity. I was trying to still just hear some sounds because I have to do that. Otherwise, I go crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So my son's here, jumping on the ball. My wife's working on the phone constantly. So I have to entertain my son. I'm watching the news. But, if I get a half a minute, I would go and like play some things on my computer and listen and record. So I started recording these sort of 30-second, 1 minute long phrases. I couldn't do any longer because there was no time or the space of mind to develop a musical idea,
Mm-hmm.
but I would just sort of spit something out and record that. Next day I would spit another thing out. So I got all these like 30-second chunks of
Did you edit
sound.
them, or was it just like unedited, minute long, 30-second long chunks?
Unedited, just things. I didn't know what to do with them.
Okay.
But finally I said, you know what? I want to send one of these sounds, which I liked one, to my music friends. And and I asked them to listen to it and respond to it and send me a sound back if they're in the right headspace to do so. And I wanted to keep the my request very simple and very relaxed because I was very stressed out.
Right.
I knew everybody else was stressed out, and I knew nobody was able to focus. So I said, if you can do this, if you feel like you want to do this, listen to it or don't listen to it, but send me a sound. It could be you responding to my sound, or it could be just you recording whatever sounds you're hearing out your window, and send it back to me. And I didn't know what I was going to do with it. But once I started doing that, I mean, it was a way of saying hello. Most importantly, it wasn't about making music. And in the process of doing that, sending that sound to people, I'm like, how are you doing? I miss you. Too bad I didn't get to see you before the lockdown, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So I had these conversations. I reached out to about 50 people, 50 musician friends, and I got to talk to all of them. And 40 of them actually sent a sound back.
I'm gonna full disclaimer here, Cenk. Just gonna own up that I was one of the 10 that didn't respond back. I think when I got it, there was. I mean, it's not an excuse. I didn't respond. I should have. I would love to have, but like, I think.
You know what?
Well, no, I know you're not asking. Yeah. I know that you don't. I know you didn't ask and you don't care, but
it's a success without you.
In spite of me, in lieu of me, it was a success. No. But just to say, like, I definitely, when I got that, I saw that, and I immediately was like, damn it, I know I'm not going to respond to this. I feel sorry, Cenk. We'll talk later, totally and I just didn't. So, but
that's totally fine, and I have full respect for people who did not respond, and I knew that it wasn't. Not everybody was going to be in the frame of mind to do so. But to my surprise, actually, more people than I thought were kindly responded. Some the next day, some 3 weeks later, and it was amazing because I got to visit. So I sent people like about a 50-second long sound, and most people kept to that duration. Most of them were listening to the sound that I sent as they were recording theirs. So I got these 1 minute long recordings from 40 different people, from people from Germany, from Turkey, and from the States, all over the States. Not all over, but places I've lived and made friends. And I got to visit everybody in their house, and I felt like I was listening. And these were very intimate recordings because they were not produced. Most of them were done on the phone, and we're talking about amazing musicians, like members of soul percussion, members of Jack Quartet. I don't know, unbelievable other cellists, drummers, trumpet players that are all of them world-class players that gave me these beautiful sounds. And it was very easy then to say, okay, I'm going to put these together to make a piece of music that's longer than a minute. So and that it was just such joy. And I did that. Even just exchanging these emails kept me sane, and then putting those sounds together in a period of a week or so was relatively easy
I
because
don't want to gloss over. Sorry to interrupt, Cenk, but
yeah,
you've said it a few times. Things like like sanity, like this kept me sane. And you mentioned early on the sort of psychological effect of what isolation can do to people. I mean,
yeah,
we can go the route of like, isolation in a prison and what that does psychologically to people. But like
yeah,
right now, I mean, I feel like I mentioned to Stephanie the other day. I said, "You're the only person I've touched since March 5th."
yeah.
Like, and not even in a sexual way. It's just like you're the only person I've hugged since March 5th, and I'm someone who likes to hug. I like to shake hands.
Yeah. I
It's not
love shaking hands.
it's not how well, it is how I judge people. It's how like if someone has a really weak handshake, to me that
Oh,
says, "Oh,
definitely.
I need to work with them on commitment." Like, and whether or not that's
Absolutely.
true, that's a judgment I'm making. But
Yeah. No,
it
I
says a
have the
lot
same.
about whether or not somebody is willing to give a hug. Whether or not a man isn't willing to give another man a hug is a big thing to me. Like like
Sure.
anyway, I read things like that, and I have had a big part of my like the days I've been curled up on the couch completely non-functional have
Yeah.
been because
Sure.
I think psychologically I really need that. I can't not have it.
Yeah.
Like I am not willing. That's a part of me I'm not willing to let go. And it
Absolutely.
took this pandemic for me to realize. And anyway, it's just like you keep mentioning sanity for you in these moments of like how do you
Yeah, I
like
think
being
everybody got tested with their sanity, didn't they? I mean, I already
yeah.
have a sort of a pretty fragile psychological makeup,
Me too, bro.
you know. Uh, but this tested it further. I was lucky. To be with my family, with
Yeah.
my wife and my son, so I didn't feel lonely. Uh, but you do feel the need to interact with people who are not your family. But I think the main thing that tested my sanity was just the terror of so many people dying, and I was thinking about my parents and things like that, like everybody, and then just watching the healthcare workers all over the world going through what they did. It was just terrorizing.
Did you have anybody that
So
you knew that passed away of COVID or something
a
related?
friend lost a parent. A few, Elaz, my wife's co-workers, and lost their parents and things like that. But nobody, no, I did not lose a friend, thankfully, to the virus. How about you?
Early on, like when right after the lockdown happened, and like they were, it was clear people were going to start dying. Like there's a gentleman named Martin Douglas who he ran one of the big steel bands in Brooklyn that I worked with a lot in Crossfire, and he was the guy that owned it, and he was like the
Mm-hmm.
figurehead of that, the paternal figurehead of that band,
Mm-hmm.
and he's of the demographic, and got it and passed away. And I was on a podcast with a Trinidadian friend of mine who knew him really well, and we both got texts at the same time, like live on the podcast. It was
Oh
like
man.
super, but it's just like all of the dystopian. I mean, my wife has had to do Zoom funerals,
Yeah. Yeah.
and some friends of ours had their 2-year-old son passed away of a freak seizure, like not even COVID related, and had to do all the services on Zoom. Like this
Oh
is
man.
Stephanie's
Yeah.
best. You
That's one
know,
of the hardest.
so, but again, the reason I asked the question, it's not to say that like anybody's tragedy is better or worse, but the thing is,
Mm-hmm.
I think this trauma, I think the psychological dismembering or disassembling of the way we I mean, every decision I made for 15 years in so percussion was, or everything decision I made in my life was based around this idea. I travel, I commute, I play in so percussion, and that means I'm in concert halls everywhere. Every piece of clothing I bought was like, is this going to be comfortable on a plane? Like all of the things. And
Yeah.
now all of a sudden, I have to make decisions completely differently. I'm home now all
Yeah.
the time. I've been home now more since March than I have been in the last 15 years. It's just true.
Yeah.
It's true. Like, and that's fucked up. That's really weird. That's a data point that is hard to swallow. And when I think of like what to say to students at SOCI or like how to prepare them moving forward, I keep coming back to like, I don't know. I'm going back to square one. So you're welcome to come there with
Yeah.
me. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Square one's, it's scary.
I
You
think
know?
that's better. I think that's better than saying, here's what I figured out and here's what we should be doing. Because I think nobody has the answer. And I'm not in a haste to figure out a new way of doing things
Mm.
in this period of time. It's great. I mean, we've all tried to communicate and to produce material with lots of split screen videos and things like this, and I think that they've been great. But we know that they're not the answer, and they're not going to replace like what we live for, which is live music. So I'm not in a hurry to find a solution or a replacement. And I think if I were a student of soci, I'd rather have you say to me, "I don't know, but let's make some music in the best way we can right now."
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
I'd rather hear that than.
For me, the square one, like going back to square one, and I kind of want to ask you, like, if there's anything maybe not even music related that you've had this. It could be parenting, it could be anything. Like for me, like when I said before, when every precedent in my life was stripped away by the pandemic, the only thing I knew how to do was press record on a podcast thing. You know, it's like I knew how to
Mm-hmm.
do that, and it was easy. There was comfort. Like I don't have to think about it. I don't have to worry about. I'm just talking. I don't have to prepare. You know, I'm not going to have questions ahead of
Mm-hmm.
time. And it was a way of me just like, what's my base? Like, what's my lowest common denominator where I can just put my shoes on and get out the door in the morning, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
for me, that's what it was. And for marimba players, I don't know what that means. For composers, like if you're a composer who's lost, I mean, for you, you improvised, I mean, with proximity, like the way you generated material. Can you talk about that for a second? Like, what are square one? Right now, you mentioned about the 1 minute sort of pieces you were doing, but like when you
Yeah.
generate material, how do you start that? Let's say we're not in the pandemic and Cenk Ergun is like, hey, I'm feeling great, have my coffee, I'm gonna write a piese of music. Like you're not gonna
Yeah.
have that deep South accent I kind of hinted at there, but what what
I
hey, that's more Ohio baby. But like what how do you start generating material?
it happens in a few different ways. I mean, proximity now that was I started composing that 15 years ago
Yeah,
now,
yeah, yeah.
and it took me a few years to compose it, and by the time it was premiered, it was 2008 or nine.
Mm-hmm.
That was my first time working with, uh, composing not with pencil and paper, but with the computer. So I was very excited about just being able to improvise on a MIDI keyboard and record that into the computer,
Which
and
was
then be able
relatively
to.
new at the time, right? Like that was a newish thing then, in terms of how the ubiquity with which composers were using it. I mean,
Yeah, maybe. No, I was kind of late to it actually.
really?
I think, yeah, I think like late '90s. I think people were already starting to do that.
I guess
So
maybe I'm grafting my own use of technology. Like I guess I just never really got. The only reason I got even equated with comfortable with MIDI is because of Dan Truman. But like I never really learned about or did much with it until like 2012 or 13. Like it just felt
yeah,
like there weren't a lot of people. There was still a lot of pen and paper, even though you may have come to it late. My perception was that there was still a lot more pen and paper when
it's
I,
still yeah,
in
yeah.
in
I
the
mean, yeah.
mid two
Now,
thousands.
now, now it's harder to find
Yeah.
pen and paper than it was then. But improvisation has always been a big part of my compositional
Mm.
process. I'm not saying that improvisation and composition are the same thing. Some people believe that. I don't believe that at all.
Why?
Because composition,
How would you define
well,
the two?
composition, with improvisation, I think no matter how smart you are with it and how how much you practice it, you are relying on a set of tools that you've developed that will help you be spontaneous and respond to things spontaneously. And the thing is, you're doing it in the moment, and you have to, in order to be a successful improviser, you have to be listening to that very moment. If
Mm-hmm.
you're playing solo, you're listening to the room. and to everybody in the audience and how things are sounding in the room. If you're playing with other people, a teacher of mine whom I love, Alvin Curran, told me this once, and I never forget it. Listening. Oh, I think I even mentioned this in the last podcast. Listening is more important than playing. Um, when improvising, this is absolutely the case. So uh, these are the priorities there, and you're gonna no matter what you fall back on your set of tools that you've acquired over the years. Uh, that can help you survive the moment. With composition, you're composing the moment, but you have months, or if you want years, to compose that moment. And you're imposing this predetermined structure onto the live concert situation. So you don't necessarily. Sometimes you know which hall and which group you're writing for, but sometimes you don't know, and the piece is the same. So you're going to impose that preformed structure onto a new situation, a new concert hall, and a new group as a composer. And every moment, I mean, my experience of composing, and this is true for a lot of composers, is you can spend hours and hours working on a second long moment in your music. You don't have that chance when you're improvising. A second long music happens, it takes a second to make.
Right, right.
So I think it's a very different way of making music. That doesn't mean that improvisation can be compositional. You can think compositionally when improvising, and also you can, vice versa. Improvisation can play a big role in composition. So those two worlds have always affected each other for me. I develop original material by improvising a lot of the times for my music. But then I shape it and I strip it away, and I layer it against itself, and so on, or I organize it in time in a more systematic way, not just an intuitive way, to make a composition. And I think it's a very different thing. And this is one of the reasons I don't really like to hear recordings of improvised music, because I feel like you have to be there for it to work. I absolutely enjoy all kinds of improvised music at live in a concert, but I rarely listen to recordings of improvised music. I've released them even, and I'm like, why did I release that? That doesn't sound.
Yeah, improvised performances are something that's just a world I don't know enough about, and I don't think I've had enough good experiences, and I don't think I've been in good enough. I mean, the yourself, present company, and So Percussion excluded. I've been lucky enough to have those experiences with So, but I just haven't had enough at bats in good improvisational situations to know up from down in terms of like. There are structures inherent in improvs too that aren't always spoken about, and there's signals that when somebody does something, by and large, most of the room understands what is about to happen, or there are crutches and tools within that too that you can read and get better at reading, and it's just something I'm not super adept at. But I'm curious when you talk about music, your own music wanting to be abstract versus about something. I mean, those are two sort of broad brushes to paint with, but what would you say to a student? I mean, because when I think about crutches and tools by which to generate material, calamitous events are a great way to at least feel like you're able to start generating material because you don't have to derive the emotion from it, right? Like or at least you don't feel like you have to. It's there, and you
Say it again. What is a great way to generate music?
Or at least
you got cut out.
Sorry. Initially, a great way to generate music is to respond to something calamitous in the environment, or something amazing, like a rainbow, or the death of your dog, or a parent or a loved one. I mean, I wrote pieces about my father. I understand what music about something is, but what do you say to a student? Like, say you have a student who comes to you and is like, "I really want to write this piece." How do you guide someone through that conversation? I mean, this is something you've thought long and hard about. You have very strong feelings as to why you feel that way. How do you speak to a student?
So a student comes to me and says, "I want to write about something."
Yeah, or that's how I want to make music. Not that I don't think you would discourage them, but like, how would you help them figure that track out in life?
Well, I was just talking to Jesse Marino yesterday.
Okay.
Who's a cellist and composer who's active in the New York scene for a long time, and she's in Berlin now, and she's brilliant. and her work often in, comes from a storytelling
Mm.
place or a thematic place. And I was saying, I really admire that because I don't know. I love stories, but I think it's so difficult to tell a good story. And she was saying, I feel like that's easy for me, but I don't know how to make music, or it's difficult for me to make music that's just about sound. And now that's an area
Mm.
I'm exploring.
Mm.
Um, I, if a student said, "I want to do this," I'd say, "Go for it." If they're, if but I don't know if I'd be a great teacher in helping them do that because I don't feel like sounds can tell a story. You can impose a story on sounds that you hear, absolutely, and everybody does, including myself. But I don't know how ever sounds tell a story.
Mm-hmm.
I think they certainly create emotions
Mm-hmm.
in us. Music, the work, music making is the work of creating emotions. That's for sure. But I don't think those emotions are always describable by words. And if words were enough to describe them, we wouldn't need the music.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
Drew Daniel gave a talk at Soci a couple years ago, and with
mhm.
Martin, and there were two things. I'm going to get one of them wrong. He said something like, recipe does not equal cake, and intention does not equal emotion. Like what you,
Hmm.
just because you've got this recipe down, like I do this, 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 and this, that doesn't mean that on the other end you're
Sure.
going to have the thing you thought you were going to have. And just because your intention, like for me, I'll use my example, my intention to write a piece about my father dying and what that meant to me, there's no way I can make everybody in the room feel that same intention because they haven't had that same experience. And so for me to, if that's the only premise upon which I'm hoping people receive my art, that's an inherently flawed position for me to be in. Now I can acknowledge that and decide to do it anyway and not care.
Sure.
But I
Right.
have to acknowledge that not everybody in the room is going to feel the same way about my dad dying as I do. And
Right.
that's tricky.
Right.
That's a hard path to walk as an
I think you
artist.
said it. I just assume that you don't have to make an extra effort. If your dad has died and you want to respond to this with your music, you don't have to make an extra effort because your dad has died and you've lived through that. And now when you make music, you're that person whose father has passed away. So it's going to be music already affected by that,
Mm-hmm.
informed by that. I think in some way, one way or another, it's audible in there. You're going to make musical choices that you otherwise perhaps would have not because you've gone through that
Right,
experience.
right.
So I don't feel like I need to. Uh, of course, I mean, every artist's work is related to their own life and their experiences in the world and the time that they're living in. And unless you're going to use words, though, lyrics and create songs, I don't feel like an extra effort is needed to try to describe emotions or give messages with frequencies and vibrations in the air. I
I'm
mean,
just going to stop you here, Cenk, and I'm going to call bullshit on something you said a minute ago when you said you don't think you'd be a good teacher. I think what you just said is amazing advice for a student. Are you kidding me? You'd be an amazing teacher, Cenk.
well,
You
I
silly
wouldn't.
goose.
Okay, no, no, I'd be a good teacher, but I wouldn't be a good teacher specifically for someone who said to me, I want to tell stories with my music. How can I best do that? My answer would be this: you don't have to do anything extra. Don't worry about it. And I don't know if that's helpful.
I don't think it's
You know,
unhelpful. I think that's amazing because here's the thing. There folks will, if they do it enough, folks will learn how that can be successful or not. I have done enough, I mean, in my little sliver of experience with what it means to write narrative based text and perform it, I've done enough to know the 90% of the time when it absolutely is a train wreck, it sucks,
mm-hmm,
and does not work,
mm-hmm,
I know when I'm headed down that path. I've just had
yeah,
four more at bats than most people, and I've had very
yeah,
few at bats actually in the grand scheme of things. But I think, but I've learned, I've realized it took me having to do it a bunch to realize, oh, there's a reason people aren't laughing or crying at this spot like I am. It's because I haven't
Yeah,
done a good
yeah.
job bringing them there, you know?
See, it's a
And
much more vulnerable position. If you're
yeah,
trying to get things right and create specific, precise reactions from the audience and create specific emotions, I think it's much more difficult and you're much more vulnerable because you're attempting a clear goal. That's why I find storytelling very difficult, and I'm like I'm not brave enough to attempt it. Because when I say this is what I'm doing is just about sounds. Enjoy and feel whatever you want to feel. That releases all. I'm not responsible for
but
if it
yeah, but
if
I
it
that
works or
makes me feel more that I feel more vulnerable in that world than I do standing on stage reading a
yeah.
text. That's my point. Like I
That's
learn
interesting.
from it,
Yeah.
but when I walk in an improvisational setting or I walk in a kitchen, I have deep anxiety because I feel like everybody's judging me. I know everybody isn't. I feel like they are. My feelings aren't proof of anything,
Well,
but
everybody is judging you.
well,
Yeah.
yes, but like I'm saying, like judging me as like a good or a bad person. Like I take it
Yeah.
there first. Like if I do the speeding up or slowing down gesture or something, Jank is never gonna talk to me again. That's where my head goes. Even though I know that's not a rational thing to think, it's just how I feel. But it's interesting to me, like it's interesting to me, and I don't know why you feel safer in a world where there's so much freedom and we're only dealing with like a very specific thing than you are in a world where we're dealing with things where everybody understands what you're saying, which are words or a story. Like people glom onto stories easier. You can do a project about abstract art about the history of slavery in the United States and never say a single word. And you could do it in such an abstract way, people might not even know what you're talking about. But if you say slavery one time,
Hmm.
everybody is going to think everything you've done is in relation to that.
Well,
And
everybody's gonna. Okay, you've said slavery, and now you have to make a relevant, valuable point,
right.
and everybody's listening. Everybody knows what you're talking about.
Even
So
me
you're,
saying it in this podcast, I'm sure anybody listening to it was
yeah,
like, "What?" Like, and that's what
okay.
happens on stage.
And you're very accountable.
Right.
You have to make sense.
Hmm.
You have to organize your thoughts in a way that makes sense to people. They can follow and they're not bored
Hmm.
and they learn something from it. And maybe there's a surprise, maybe that there's something they hadn't thought of. You're responsible and accountable for all these things. It's huge.
Hmm.
That's very stressful to me.
Yeah.
Whereas I can be like, look, man, this is just sounds. Don't worry about it. Like, what did it mean? What is it about? Nothing. Whatever you want it to be. That's much easier. It's
Yeah.
almost like what do you say, copping out?
Well, yeah,
Or
but I think the words can feel that way. Again, my feelings of it aren't proof. What I used to feel that way when people would say that to me. I used to feel that way. I used to have that same reaction of like, really, really, you know. But the truth is it's a language like anything else. You get better at it. Just because I don't understand Cyrillic doesn't mean Russian isn't a language that people speak and can get along with fluently with each other. And I think improvisation, in the same way that you know Awe drumming from Ghana or composition or whatever, is just a language I haven't spoken that much. And that's why
yeah.
I feel insecure there. I think that's where I'm saying
Hmm.
I don't. I'm terrified because I don't speak. I know how to say hello and where's the bathroom in that language,
Yeah.
and I say it with a terrible
Yeah.
accent, and so everybody's like, "Oh, that guy." When I walk in the
Well,
improv room.
but hold on. Improvisation is not a language. It's a method of speaking a language. I think there are many languages of improvisation,
Mm,
right? There are many kinds of improvisation in different musical cultures.
mhm.
There's jazz improvisation. There's uptight new music experimental
That might be
improvisation.
where most of my experience has come from, just to be clear. So that
Yeah,
I'm trying to notice my own baggage here when I.
yeah. No, I mean, I have that baggage too. And then there's improvisation in a lot of Middle Eastern music built into a song structure or a
Hmm.
concert structure. You introduce, and even also in classical music, which we now tend to think of as written down, notated, strict music. There was a lot more room in the past for improvisation than there is now. Uh,
Yeah, most of Bach's
or
stuff was just
maybe,
a lead sheet.
yeah, or Couperin
Hmm.
harpsichord works, or figure bass and preludes, and the idea of a prelude is also existent in Turkish music, where you introduce a composition with an improvisation in the mode in which that composition was written.
Really? Is
So
that what style of Turkish music is that common in?
that's classical Turkish music that's been around for hundreds of years or thousands of years, and it's called taksim.
Sorry, say
And
you
you do a
you
little
cut out there for a
taksim.
second. Can you say that one more time?
The word is taksim.
Taksim. How do you
T
spell
A
that?
K T A K S I
Okay.
M, and that's a form of music. I think the equivalent in the West is prelude, and correct me if I'm wrong, but lots of preludes were improvised,
Mm-hmm.
introducing the main composition. And this is an opportunity for the performer to come to the foreground and not the composer. The performer shows their ability to and their fluency in that mode and with their instrument. Uh, while introducing the composition, they get to show off a little bit with their
That's
moment of
I'm
improvisation.
I'm asking these questions from complete ignorance here, so please don't laugh right in my face. But
Mhm.
like, does it have any relationship to like the preludes from the Bach cello suites, for example? Like, as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, like, I've played a few of them on marimba. The
Mhm.
preludes are usually just like, not always, but cycling through all the chord changes, telling you what it's
Mhm.
like, when you're writing a 5 paragraph essay, it's like, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then the rest of the dances
Yeah,
are like, I'm going to tell you, I told you, and then at the end it's like, here's
yeah,
what I told you, and
yeah,
the
exactly.
prelude
Yeah.
is often that way in Bach cello suites. I'm just asking out of ignorance, is there a relationship there, or is the Turkish history of it just completely its own
I
strain?
think it's the same exact thing.
Okay.
Here's how it's going to go, and it's going to be in this mode, and here are the kinds of things that I'm going to do. For a few minutes, you do that, and people get a sense of the performer, not just the composition. Maybe they already know the
You
composition, but
need to
they haven't
write
heard it.
preludes for your music, Cenk.
Huh?
What's the prelude for snares?
For snares, I mean,
You
yeah.
need to write little preludes that just feature the four of us, rather than us like
Feature-
having to hold four bass drum mallets trying to play really fast four mallet stuff.
The prelude is just you standing up with those mallets and standing silently, I think, for a while.
Well, that's really fascinating. I had no idea. That's really cool. I need to have you come back and talk to Sosi Kids just about the history of what you know about Turkish music.
That's all I had. So,
Oh, well, good. It'll be quick. It'll be a quick in and out 5 minute pop in, tell your piece, and you can go. But that's really cool. Well, what?
yeah,
Go ahead. Sorry, you were going to say something.
I have been. I've been thinking more and more about Turkish music because for the past 10 years, I've been really interested in intonation
Mm-hmm.
and working, with microtonality, but specifically in the context of just intonation, which deals with the harmonic series and the relationships between the harmonics of different fundamentals. And working with different tuning systems, building scales out of harmonic relationships. When I say harmonic, I mean overtones.
Mm-hmm.
And working in this way, I have discovered what's been obvious to many others: many relationships between Western music and Western uh, melodic structures, harmonic structures, and Turkish and Middle Eastern music. There's a lot of overlap, and there are bridges that were built hundreds or if not thousands of years ago. So that's been very interesting to me because I've had training in the Western classical tradition. This is the musical training I started in Turkey. I did not study Turkish music. I heard it,
Mm-hmm.
I listened to it, I knew it, but I never studied it. So I'm now learning it almost from a Western perspective. I have it in my blood and my ears, but my brain that's learning it is a Western classically trained brain.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been amazing to see these similarities or connections. And I'm reading this book now, who my friend Cleek Schrey recommended to me. Is called A Division of the Tetrachord, which traces I can send you a link. It's on a website. The whole book is,
Mm-hmm.
but it's talking about the relevance and the significance of the tetrachord and the role it's played in ancient Greek music, ancient Middle Eastern and Arabic and Turkish music, and the way that these structures have played a role in the evolution of Western music to until today, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point there, it talks about Pythagoras actually bringing the diatonic scale, the idea of the diatonic scale, to Greece, to ancient Greece. We're talking about 2,000, 3,000 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
from Egypt or somewhere in the Middle East, where they already had the notion of the diatonic scale.
Yeah.
And Pythagoras discovering this and bringing it to ancient Greece. He's also, responsible for discovering the idea of harmonics, and that
Yeah.
that the string length is proportional to the frequency it produces, and things like this. So
Well,
we owe a
and
lot to
Pythagoras is a big he's a big name in the steel band world because of like the lead pan is literally set up in the Pythagorean circle of fifths,
sure,
and the way
sure,
harmonics interact on steel drums, like they're people who build steel drums are very aware of the math and all of that stuff behind
yeah,
the Pythagorean,
sure.
all that stuff.
And back in that day, if you look at a map of where Pythagoras lived, is ancient Greece. It's now Greece, but it's also bordering Turkey, and if you go a little east, it's Iran, Iraq,
Mm-hmm.
Syria, and all these places. If you go a little south, it's North Africa. So there's a lot of cross pollination
Yeah.
in these worlds and in these music, and they're all informed by each other.
Mm.
And when you go back a little further and go back to the fundamentals of sound, meaning fundamental. When I say fundamentals, like how frequencies relate to each other and how can they be understood in mathematical terms. These connections between different musical cultures become very, very clear and obvious.
Mm.
So it's been sort of interesting to discover that.
I think about your music a lot when I think of, when people talk about harmonies being rhythms and what it means. And I hear some people are like, oh, yeah, cool, like good, good point. And it's just like, let's get past that. I'm just like, yeah. But hold on a second. Like, hold on a second. Like, you've never stood next to an organ and played the low
Yeah.
pedal C and then played the fifth above it. And you've never heard blap da ga da blap da ga da. You've never heard that? That doesn't register
Yeah.
to you at all as something fundamental in what we do. And not that you, I'm not implying here that like you're necessarily like in your music being like, this is where I'm playing the rhythm of the minor sixth. Like that's not
Yeah.
what you're thinking, but you do think of rhythm on this very sub conscious level, something that goes by in this way that if you squint at it, it's like a smooth plane, but as soon as you get close to it, you're like, oh my god! It's like looking under a telescope, one of those electron microscopes. Like you realize how much is going on the surface of a piece of paper.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said is, I think that's my religion. I mean, it's like I don't separate rhythm and frequency. They're one and the same thing. So
Literally, I mean,
yeah.
literally.
So yeah, literally. I mean, when you have a rhythm and it gets fast enough, it becomes pitch. It's like this very basic physics fact. So I don't think of them separately. And when I'm composing, I'm never like, okay, I got this cool chord. What rhythm is it going to have? It comes as a package. The
Right.
instrument, the dynamic, the rhythm, and or everything. It's one thing. It's not separable.
Yeah, have you heard
For me.
there's that organization Make Music New York.
Yeah, of course.
A couple years ago, they did something with Doug Perkins and Amy Garapick, I think, was part of it. And they were at the top. They started at the top in Inwood in Manhattan. One person had a bass drum, one person had a snare drum, a marching snare drum. And they just they had on click, and they marched from Inwood all the way down to Battery Park. It took them 6 hours, and they just played along with the click. Like they had to hit the drum every time there was a click, right? And so for 6 hours, it's just these two people walking through Manhattan playing polyrhythms against each other. 6/2, 3/2, and it's just like for 6 hours, right? And so they get down
Oh
there,
my
they
God.
take the whole recording and they speed it up so that it takes a minute to play. And what you get is a Christmas Carol.
What? This is how they planned it?
Yeah, and so when you
Oh
speed
my
up that
God, these
rhythm,
people are
it
crazy.
plays a Christmas Carol because they figured out the notes you need in that amount of time. It's just ratios, it's just math. And
Yeah,
again, it's like
yeah,
that is a super nerdy thing to do. I'm not so sure I want to use 6
yeah.
hours of my life like that. You'll never get it back. But it's kind of rad. That's kind of cool that
Yeah,
that
yeah.
works,
I'm glad somebody did it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm not going to do it, but glad somebody
yeah.
did. Well, Cenk, I'm really grateful for your time. We've been talking for about an hour now, and it's 9. It's probably now 10 o'clock in Germany for you.
Yep.
I'm grateful for your time, bro. I am grateful for
Thanks
anybody
for having me, Josh.
anybody who gives me their time during, especially this insane moment in our humanity. I'm grateful for, and it's not lost on me. So I
It's a pleasure.
appreciate your time. Is there any place where folks can check out what you're working on now? The 1 minute project that you did, is it up anywhere
Well,
where folks
that
can
did
see it?
get, yes, did get finalized. It's on Bandcamp.
Okay.
The piece ended up being called Amore Vieni, which means "Come, my love,"
Mm-hmm.
and in Italian. And I don't know how to give my Bandcamp web page
I'll find it.
address
I'll find it, and I'll just
easily,
link it to the podcast.
but it's there as an album. And if it's free to listen. But if you want to pay money, the money goes to New Music Solidarity Fund.
What is that?
Some people have supported it. It's a fund created for performing musicians who've lost all their gigs, and it's been created by New Music USA. Uh, so I was able to just humbly raise a little bit of money for musicians through that. But you don't have to pay. But if you feel like it, that's where the money will go.
Okay.
But I hope people will check it out. Yeah.
Well, I'll send
And
them.
I think we're going to be talking about this at SOCI, this piece.
Good.
Jason was talking to me about that. So
Well, good. I'm glad. Well, then, I'm really glad. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. I think we're going to post this. I hope students get a chance to. It's always hard, especially now that we're not doing it in person. Like, if students aren't going to get to meet you and talk to you and like get to know who
Yeah.
you are just over dinner.
that's
or
better,
whatever.
It's keep the mystique. Otherwise, when you meet
Well-
me in person, it all dissolves. It's a problem.
Well, I think this will be a good primer for that discussion. If folks can watch this, they'll have a little bit more context behind what it is that you all talk about.
Oh, this is going to be watched. I'm glad I wore a shirt.
You look fantastic. I'm the one who looks like a homeless person, dude. I look like a schlub. You look great. You look like you.
Hey, one last thing I wanted to say. What was interesting about Amore Vieni, I did this completely. This came to my mind, this idea, but very quickly I discovered lots of other people doing the same kind of piece, exactly exchanging sounds or requesting sounds from each other. One is Drew from Matmos. And he, I sent personal emails to people. He did it on Twitter, and of course he's got like a major following. So he got like 6,000 sounds, I think, and like did the piece. So you should check this piece out, and that should be a part of the conversation with your students. There's also Charmaine Lee. I wonder if you're familiar with her. An amazing
I know
vocalist.
of her, but I don't know.
Yeah, vocalist, composer, improviser in New York. She did a similar thing, but she kind of wins because she asked her friends for the sounds and didn't compose. She just put them up as tracks. She didn't touch them. So I think that's a much more selfless, graceful thing to do. But I think she must have felt the same need to hear her friends' sounds from their homes. So that's also on Bandcamp. And I know there's multiple other ones. So it was very interesting to me that many people had the same instinct to do this almost same exact thing.
It'll be interesting to look back on the rings of our tree, to go back and listen to podcasts I did when the coronavirus first hit, just to look at ourselves as like, we are not exempt from evolution. We are not snapshots. Every day we are on a spectrum of changing for the better, the worse. Some days I'm 2 steps forward, and some days I'm 3 steps back, and I shit the bed completely as a human. And I feel like it's going to be nice to look back, I think, and sort of look at all this stuff and be like, oh wow, like, I don't know where we're going to be in a year, but
Sure. I wanted to mark this moment with
Yeah.
that piece. That was the main thing.
I think it's good, and I think
I'm
it's
glad you're doing these. I'm glad you're doing these because these are gonna be valuable in the future.
well. I think this is good. It's good advice. I think
Conversations.
talking about you being a teacher, I think students taking this advice of just like mark this moment. Like you don't need to do it for better or worse. You just need to do it for you. Like mark it to see where you've come since this. Like, and if for nothing else, that'll bring you health. I think in the long run. So.
Absolutely.
Cenk, you're a good egg,
Thanks
buddy.
so much.
I appreciate you. I hope we can do this in person. Although it seems like the U.S. is going to be banned from flying the EU, so I'm not so sure I'm going to get to see you anytime soon in person. But podcast mic's always on, buddy.
Sometime soon. Love you, Josh.
All right, love you too, bro. Take
And
it easy.
have fun with Sosi.
Will do. All right, see you, buddy.
Ciao.
Okay, this podcast was brought to you by Liquid Drum, liquiddrum.com. Todd Meehan down in Waco, Texas, runs an amazing company. Check him out, you won't regret it. Liquiddrum.com. Also, all the steel drums I play on and teach on, both at Princeton and at NYU, are built by Kyle Dunleavy, Dunleavy Pans.com. And you can also check out an organization run by my friend Kendall Williams called Pan in Motion. And check them out at panandmotion.com. All right, hope you're all doing well. Talk to you soon.